I want to welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And my life is quite easy today because I will present Professor Henrique Barros. He's a well-known epidemiologist, director of Institute of Public Health, Porto University. It's a well-known institution, and he has been the director of the HIV program, national program, for several years. He's going to talk with us about HIV from a complex spillover towards a human infection. Professor Henrique Barros, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you very much for taking the time and being here. It's really a pleasure to have you here. This might look a little bit out of scope, but if you remember that the idea of One Health is equally protect human beings, animals, and the environment, and trying to overcome the silos in which we are mostly organized. I think this is a relevant point, but I must confess that the idea came also because this was the real first pandemic that we faced in my lifetime, and for my generation was a tremendous source of knowledge and pain also. When I was thinking about my presentation today, I really remember Fred Mercury, and somebody asked him in '84 something about the future, and he said, "What will I be doing 20 years time? I'll be dead." And in fact, he died in 1991 because in those days HIV was an untreatable infection, and that was why it was considered a death sentence. But things changed exactly after 1991, in fact, and AIDS became a different story, moving from death sentence to a chronic disease management. And as you see in the end of my talk, there might be the time to write a new book, say, moving from death sentence to chronic disease management, and from chronic disease management to eradication. And why was this? Because in these early days, people understood that we need open science, participatory research, citizen science, because what we need, in fact, is research, not a Syria, as we are living to a certain extent now. HIV began officially, let's say, with this small publication in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report of 5 cases of pneumonia with a relatively rare agent in those days, Pneumocystis carini, that now changed the name. They all were male, relatively young, and like active homosexuals. And they had this, there was this unexpected cluster of cases, which to a large extent define an epidemic situation. And there was an editorial note accompanying this description, calling attention to some of these aspects, and calling our attention to the fact there was a cellular immune dysfunction that was predisposing people to an opportunistic infection. And we have not the time to go through the history of all this, but the number of hypotheses, the number of different names that this got. And in those days, I was a resident in gastroenterology, and I was seeing many patients because of diarrhea. And what we call in those days to this was gay bowel syndrome, because we are not aware of the situation, the whole situation. But HIV told us a lot of interesting things to organize our life. And there was this kind of dispute between the French group of Luc Montagnier and in the lab, led by Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, and people in New York, people from the lab of Robert Gallo. And, making short a very long story, this cost a lot of lives because the dispute around the intellectual property of all these. So who was going to get the money with the diagnostic tests, in fact, to translate it in real world words, cost a lot of deaths, for instance, to people with hemophilia that were unnecessarily brutally infected. And then I think if you want to see it this way, the Nobel Prize people decide in favor of the French, because when they gave the Nobel Prize, they only gave it to the French scientists, and didn't divide it with Gallo or his team. And this brings a sort of a moral dimension of all this. And I think, if you allow me to bridge to the One Health idea that brings us all together here, that's this moral dimension that is also present in the idea of a One Health approach. Because if we don't want to be altruistic, at least let's be intelligent and egoist and solve the problem for us and the remaining people. Well, we had this infection, people suffering, an agent, a disease. Sorry, because it's in Portuguese, Pliny the Old. Quotation is very well known from Africa. There are always things coming, new things coming. Maybe if it was now, and if we're talking about COVID-19, you say, excess from China, different things are coming, but probably there is a circle of all this. And this is why it makes sense to remember AIDS. It's one of the reasons why it makes sense to remember AIDS, because since the virus was identified, isolated, studied, and we need to remember that 40 years ago, our technological tools, our molecular biology solutions were not 40 years ago, I would say, was centuries ago from what we have now. So it takes longer, it was more difficult, things you also know. But it was possible to connect this with a transmission from non-human old world primates, non-human primates. And it's interesting to see that the different types of HIV that were identified, different groups, subtypes, were related to different species. And this makes quite clear one thing that we tend to forget, that a pandemic and a spillover or multiple spillovers can occur at relatively close moments in very different places, and taking different routes to occur. So this is not one single event. And I think AIDS shows that it's really, it was in this case and in many other cases, sort of a shared situation. And there is one thing that is especially important. If you remember the Ebola times, and you go back even earlier to the early 70s, that one of the most important challenges we have now is to be able to make a sort of a participatory surveillance. The surveillance systems we have are not enough, are not appropriate for what we want. And we need to have very active, intelligent, as state-of-the-art as possible surveillance systems close to where the spillovers are possible. And not imagine that we live in a sort of a world with the defensive cross borders, because viruses, they don't take care, they don't care about that. The early spread of this epidemic to human populations probably began much earlier. When you go to the phylogenetically description of all these. And there were initially a few sera that were positive. They belonged to kids that have been involved in a nutritional state study in the late 50s in Africa, in Central Africa. But then it was possible to go much earlier to the 20s of the past century. And here again, it is the relevance of the surveillance system and of a network of health services, because that's why I was calling your attention to Ebola. It's because the fact that there was a moment where it was possible to look for an agent, to look for a virus, was because in that special case, there was a Belgian nurse that was able to understand the situation, look for walk the miles to reach a health center. And although it was not of any hope for her because she died, but it was possible to get a blood sample. That blood sample was sent to Belgium, to the Institute of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in Antwerpen, and that began the process with Peter Piot and all the people that was able, that allow us the identification of the agent. Because, I mean, people was dying in places where there were no way of communication. And now we need to take advantage of the tools we have, like the mobile phones. So there are many things that remain to be well understood. Why the group M is the real responsible for the pandemic, why other agents like OOP are much less present. So there are many things to discover, and they might help us to understand, for instance, not only the dynamics of spillovers, but also the dynamics of the infection, as being able to establish among other populations, other species, namely in human populations. But there is, as you can see here, it was possible to connect the different types of HIV-1 and HIV-2 to different animal species. So that there is this is a clear situation of the involvement of an agent that was not among human, and that became now a human agent. And probably only a human agent, unless there are something interesting like what we are seeing now, and should be a warning signal that, for instance, leprosy is moving from humans to chimps. And by the way, as you saw, SARS-CoV-2 was infecting animal husbandries, and that's why they killed all those, what's the name in English? Yeah, in Netherlands and in Denmark. So why this variability? Is this from the very beginning, or it was related with errors in transcription? Because HIV also brought knowledge about something that we were almost not aware of. The fact that there are viruses that use this way of infecting. And this also creates the necessity of, let's say, inventing or repurposing the molecules we have to make treatments. But it has also to do a lot with recombinations to superinfection, and particularly with population migration. So this was the first moment. I mean, I think AIDS should have avoided, if you really care and were wise enough, had money enough, the interest enough, and would avoid the discrimination, because it was mainly a sexually transmitted disease, and then it was mainly a disease of poverty, to find and to understand that similar things was happening in the near future. And so now we have a disease, very, very diverse, very, very interesting from a medical and a research point of view. But I'm bringing this because you all know the modes of acquisition. But as you know, for instance, in a country like Portugal and many other countries in Europe, a huge proportion of cases are considered unknown mode of transmission. But when we are careful, only 0.2% of these carefully reviewed 32,000 cases, only 0.2% had nuclearly defined risk factor. So we need to put much more emphasis in looking for modes of transmission, not accept that we don't know or we are unable to get it, because it might be of major importance to understand again the dynamics of the infection in the population. Where does it come from? As I said, the fact that it's essentially related to sexual behavior and that transmission is very dependent on viral load. This change was one of the reasons why we could make a real difference in the way to do it. And for instance, now you understood the role of circumcision. For instance, people with circumcision had a much lower risk of infection, even under natural conditions, without doing nothing special to avoid the infection. And we understood that there are different moments in the evolution of this infection, and there is now something that we need to take into consideration if we want to avoid outbreaks of this infection, because for the time being we have no vaccine. So most people is susceptible, and outbreaks, epidemics of HIV can appear anywhere, any moment. That's something we almost forget in our daily life. It's very important to know what situation around the initial phase, the acute illness, and know one thing that we in the clinics, not me, they not in clinics anymore, don't pay sufficient attention is to the acute retrovirus, the initial phase of infection. We can diagnose it. When we are careful in questioning patients about the hypothetic beginning of the infection, most of them are able to remind some symptoms, something different from the usual, and many even look for some help, like going to an emergency room or looking for a professional advice. And most of these symptoms are similar to non-specific symptoms. And we tend to avoid talking about sex still now. These things disappear. So if doctor tells the patient, well, don't worry because this is going to disappear in 2-3 days, he or she almost always are right. So they seem to be very good doctors, but in fact they didn't make the important question. Have you been here or there? What have you done during the last 15 days, considering your sex life or your use of drugs or injections, whatever. So we now moved a lot during these years, and that's what I mainly want to remember, is that our ability to diagnose the infection, to identify people with these viral loads, able to transmit it, changed a lot during these years, because the quality of the serological approaches, the tests, the point-of-care tests, the very sophisticated tests, all these improved enormously. So, but they are not, they can be even better than they are. And then we have this set point, the moment where things became really chronical and moved towards the situation of chronic disease. Most of these people are asymptomatic, though they present they might present some signs or symptoms. But what I want to tell you that we now are able to avoid AIDS, meaning the presence not of these situations like some peripheral neuropathies or cervical dysplasia or anal dysplasia or anal or symptoms like fever, diarrhea. They don't define AIDS. In Portugal, AIDS was mainly defined because of tuberculosis. That was, and that's something, because he's going to smile, but this epidemic of tuberculosis that should be associated with the 2,000 cases per year we have of HIV during the 80s and early 90s. They never appeared, in fact. So we missed something, at least in our statistics. I'm not saying that we missed them as patients, we missed them in our statistics. And the most interesting thing for us is HIV-2, which I have not time to go into much details, but just to tell you that it's very interesting, because if you look at HIV-2 from the north of Portugal, you see a disease of old guys that have been in Africa, in West Africa during the colonial wars. And if you look to HIV-2 from Lisbon, you'll see black women, pregnant, young, that came from that part of the world recently. So it's a completely different story that you can, a different narrative, if you just study HIV-2 in the north of Portugal, or if you study HIV-2 in the south of Portugal. And of course, HIV-2 is disappearing almost from everywhere, but in the north completely disappeared because most of these guys died, and the ability of HIV-2 to be transmitted is much lower. So the epidemic didn't continue. What changed all these medication, the antiretroviral treatment, and it moved from up to 20 pills per day to 1 pill every day. This is wonderful. The number of different molecules have been increasing and increasing and increasing. Now it's the time where they probably will be decreasing, because HIV is becoming now, as many other diseases, many of those that interest in One Health, diseases from the south, diseases related to poverty, and they are not interesting markets for promoting investigation. So we need to rethink about all this. What is interesting also is how are we aging with HIV? There is all this discussion about immune senescence, but as you can see now, people living with HIV, for instance, in the US, almost half are 50 years of age or older. So it's a completely different picture in 40 years. And that's why I think it's interesting for us that want to confront One Health approach, and especially zoonotic diseases, is to imagine that it's possible to control this. It's possible to change the picture. That's my major message, if you allow me. But people aging with HIV, they are aging in a worse condition, and it's not only for biological reasons, but also for psychological reasons, because they had to face very often the stigma and discrimination related to the disease and to the conditions that people associate with disease. Drug use, sex work, men who have sex with men, and so on. And the quality of life of these people is really lower than the quality of life of people that are HIV negative. And that's something that we can prevent. It's our responsibility to prevent. I'm coming to the end. The major thing is that we are facing a different syndemic, not only the so-called many epidemics of poverty, but the role of the interplay with the psychosocial conditions. This is very common in the Western world. Just to finish very quickly, 38 million people living now with HIV. So there is room for new cases, in many cases. But almost same people died. And now the number of people dying is completely different. And that's if we took a fast-track intervention, we could even decrease much more the number of cases. So it's in our hands to decrease this. And to avoid what is expected is that COVID-19 will increase, will double the number of deaths because people have no access to prevention, namely PrEP. In Portugal, as you can see, it decreased a lot, and what changed was mainly the infection associated with drug use. Although that's something that would be wonderful to understand, people is coming exactly in the same clinical situation with same number of CD4 counts. So our preventive, our outreach approaches apparently are not working as much as we would love. So we need to understand things. We are close to the 1990 approach for diagnosis, therapy, and viral suppression. Because viral suppression means no transmission, that's essential if you want to prevent. So this is the old idea of undetectable, untransmissible. And we have this vision that we might end the epidemic of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and so on, by 2030, which I don't believe, obviously, because we didn't reach also the objectives of the Millennium Development Goals. But it's a kind of a target that we should not forget. We can do it if we don't leave people in the middle of this cascade, of this chain from detection to therapy. And we have this responsibility as in 8 years, 9 years, end AIDS as a public health threat. And if we understand this, if we are able to do this, zero discrimination, zero new infections, zero AIDS deaths, I think we learn a lot to face the other problems that we have. But as you can see, it's a very ambitious program that either there is a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of commitment of all the society, not only politicians, or we'll be far away from this in the near future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Henrique, for your fantastic presentation. I don't know if there are any questions from participants. Yes? So at the end.
Back to the slide that gorillas and continues.
Which one, sorry?
Gorillas and
Not make difficult questions. This one?
No, yeah.
This one, yeah.
just for your attention. First, we need to understand the cause. And look at that. Small monkey there on the back. And it's like the tool.
Yep.
Okay. It's actually 25 years ago.
Patient in Lisbon.
Okay. So, in a patient had from himself. West Arm. And this is the very common, like, it's like just walking down and there was those chips. Right. So it's really complicated.
Okay, we have one more question.
By the way, while he's making his question, the first case in Portugal, I think now we can tell it because it's 40 years. It was 40 years ago. Was a a soldier coming from Guinea-Bissau, living in Terras do Boi, it's a small village in the north of Portugal. He died without known cause. And 7 or 8 or 9 years later, his wife appeared, and now then we were already aware of HIV. So in retrospect, it was possible to know that it was exactly the same situation. So from that small monkey, sorry, to a man, a man from the man to another man. As pets.
Enrique,
Okay, one more question. Yes.
Enrique, one of the things that you did not talk at all about it, but this is probably my ignorance than anything else, is vaccines for HIV. Do you know whether this new drive for mRNA vaccines, that it's really taking over, because there are lots of mRNA vaccines being developed for tuberculosis and for lots of different things at the moment? Is there something that is being thought about HIV?
It's being tested already.
Okay. Can you just update
And
us?
the first one didn't work well, but probably it's because there are so many things in a vaccine that you need to fix. It's not, but there are many groups now working with trying to find a vaccine for HIV.
Anyone promising? Any vaccine promising?
The first one didn't work well, but probably there's going to be for sure.
Thank you. To remember those things. This is a zoonosis, right? Yeah. Okay. But there are a lot of heterogeneity in the way we look and we handle this zoonosis. Nobody, I don't know, nobody is working with these monkeys trying to control the disease there, the epidemics there. No, the question, we are controlling the epidemic globally because we lose the stupidity of only to treat HIV patients when the CD4 were low. It's a stupidity. So now we diagnose, we treat. But the important point in this, looking as one else, is globalization. As you know, as you told, Congo, Belgium was the epicenter, and some years after, it appears in IT because they talk French, and the professors changed and took that. So globalization is a fantastic thing. So, and HIV too, we keep, we detect 1-2 cases a year still. But old people, they do not, I don't remember, one soldier, 71, he transmitted to the wife, but not to the children. And he died, both died without treatment because they do not want to treat 10 years ago. So it's a fantastic model to study the heterogeneity of disease also.
And this story of 4H is, Erwin, homosexual, IT, and first one. Erwin, homosexual, IT, and this one is hemophilia, of course. Yeah. But the story Carlos is telling is very interesting because, when there were lots of people from IT working in Congo, then they went back to their home country. The infection was not diagnosed because they still don't health network of care. But some moved to the US, and there was a sort of sexual tourism between the US and the islands. So it was one of the possible ways of spreading the disease around.
Coming back to Adriano's comments and taking this the issue from the zoonotic point, don't you think that it is necessary to understand the epidemics and the epidemiology of this disease in the source, which are probably the monkey population? Because you mentioned, and I think the idea is very interesting, from moving from control to eradication. But when we talk about eradication in the veterinary side, we assume that we need to suppress the source. We see when we go to, we had, comparing to tuberculosis, we had very well successful programs to control tuberculosis. But when the cattle moves into near the wildlife, and because wildlife is now infected, our eradication programs, they fail. And they fail because we are effective in suppressing let's say in cattle populations, but we are not achieving, and this was mentioned this morning. And regarding to HIV or other type of virus which are endemic, probably endemic in the wildlife populations, don't you think we need first to understand clearly how it jumps? Because we can suppress in the human population, at least to control it to a very low level. But since our globalization and people, in fact, they travel around the world, if we move around the world and you bring the virus again into a domain, into a region where the virus is not anymore present, so we have introduced it again. So
no, yeah, I agree, but the point, you know, so the idea is every pandemic is preceded by a spillover somewhere or in different points relatively close. So, are we ready to detect these rare events? To do it, we need to have surveillance where they occur. That's why I said we need a new type of surveillance. We need so-called participatory surveillance. That's the way we call it now in epidemiology, because it depends a lot on the so-called curious or observer. For instance, I didn't tell it, but probably the discovery of HIV, let's say, had nothing to do with this. There was a bureaucrat in the US, in Atlanta, I think, that was responsible for the clearance of the authorization of pentamidine. And he called somebody saying, what the hell is happening? Because I only have to send 1 or 2 treatments every other month, and I got 5 or 6 or 10 now in a week. So, I mean, it was just somebody delivering the authorization, saying yes to a prescription. So this, when you have somebody that is curious, that pays attention to what is going in front of you, we can. That's an important sign. We can begin the process of researching more in depth and so on. So that's important to increase the literacy, the relevance of these situations in the small communities, making them part, every community being part of the surveillance system. So moving from a professional surveillance system to a surveillance system that involves those that can be relevant to detect the problem in the very beginning. But I was trying to say another thing that I don't know if it's fair to put it so clearly, because probably it's stupid, but you know, is there an HIV circulating among chimps and monkeys? Is it? Probably no. But I'm not sure. There is probably another one that maybe we will come back, will spill over to us. But this one, I think the risk might be the other way around. You know, go back to the animals. That's why, you know, the HIV as we know it, if we have this strategy of making everybody infected, treated, and suppressed, the virus will stop circulating among human population. If there will be another one appearing from these animals, then you need the surveillance, as we are trying to create surveillance systems for the bats, for instance, to try to understand other zoonoses. And all this needs much more. There is a discussion about the pandemic treaty. Are we ready as societies, as countries, as international community to have a pandemic treaty, considering all this? Well, this costs money.
But you were talking about surveillance systems, and during your presentation, you talked about surveillance systems are not good enough.
Yeah.
In fact, when you see some countries have huge difficulties in notifying HIV cases, even us, we have a surveillance system, but it's not good enough. We have several important gaps. We don't even know, for instance, if they are screened for LTBI, if they do preventive therapy or essential information. What is missing? What can be done in order to improve our surveillance system, in order for us to understand what is the real picture and define a better strategy.
No, I thought you were going to answer. I think we have only 1 minute. So the problem is that when you talk about surveillance systems, there are different layers of complexity. In Portugal, the reasons why we lack a certain number of information are related to lack of appropriate organization, for instance. But the impact of that ignorance, let's say, might be less relevant than the impact of ignoring the events occurring in Africa, for instance, that will be the father and the mother of a new pandemic. So, if you allow me, Raquel, I think that's why HIV is very, very important to our general understanding of the relation between disease and society and so on. We need to make people more aware of their importance as being, to use the slogan now, public health agents, and providing the information. For instance, we still, in Portugal, in other countries also, but maybe some a little bit better, we still lack a lot of self-reporting of side effect of drugs, for instance. If I take a drug and I have a certain number of symptoms or problems and I don't report it, but just a small story. There are a few great HIV patients in Portugal. They are really the so-called patient experts. And one of them tried and began using one of these new drugs. And he was complaining to his doctor of a certain number of things that he was feeling that were not as usual. And usually doctors do it. I think they do it. They continue to do it. If it seems not a very important thing, they try to say, don't take too much. Don't give it too much importance. This is going to disappear. But in this case, after some time, it was one of the recognized health side effects of the drug, and now it appears in every description. So it's important to give the people not only the right, because the right is the less you can give them, but to reward them, at least psychologically, for cooperating in providing the information. I think that's the key for all this. But
to finalize, I want just very short questions.
Very short.
Very short answers.
Thank you. Eric, thank you so much for this nice presentation. In fact, my question is a little bit related with the answer that you gave to the question of Lisa, and a little bit provocative. So I would like to ask what we need to learn how does these populations of these species, wild ones, they deal with the disease. Can we learn something, and can we use this learning to, let's say, develop medicines or treat or establish approach to deal with the propagation, the disease, and also came up with the solutions. These can be also natural solutions, not only therapeutic ones. Do you think this is possible? Thank you.
No, it's completely possible. It's needed. It is desperately needed, but we need to pay for that. You know, to send teams of people going to Africa, to different areas in Southeast Asia and so on, to as veterinaries and medical human doctors to get that information, because you know just it's something that is the same. You know, hepatitis B was impossible to reproduce in experimental animals, but studying the Beijing duck hepatitis virus, it was possible to understand a lot of what was going on with the human hepatitis B. So it's essential, I'd say, but it's very expensive because it's you have even to pay for the security of the people going there. So it's, but that's a choice if you want to really tackle all these things and to control.
Professor Nizar, very, very short question.
Enrique, just it's not making a talk, but just don't you think that on grounds of surveillance we should get databases mixing, reuniting all the data from the humans, from the animals, and from the wildlife side? Virus, bacteria, diseases, receptors, and
now
this
it's so easy to do a platform.
This is very easy to do it. ISPUP perhaps can do it.
Yeah.
Professor Henrique, to finalize, one word, what can we learn from HIV and apply to COVID?
The central role of people in decision making.
Thank you. I think it was a really amazing session. We had the opportunity to hear about history of HIV. This was really One Health discussion. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.